Hello, I am Orion and part of the Orion Microcampus group. Microcampus is a program where 16 Shanghai American school students go to a small village in China. More specifically in Yunnan Province, Dali Region, Shizhou Village. This group of students have a goal to expand their intercultural understanding, to grow as people, to learn from experience, and to have a positive impact on the places they go. When I was back in Shanghai, I had to do some planning before I came out into the village. I had to pick a topic that I was interested in that applies to Shizhou, meaning that I can conduct research here and look for clues in Shizhou. My topic is the Flying Tigers. The Flying Tigers were a volunteer squadron that fought against the Japanese during World War II. This group was stationed in Kunming, where they had a base and kept planes. These planes, P-40 Warhawks, would then fly over the hump, known as the Tibetan Plateau, to get supplies from Burma. In order to go high enough to fly past the hump, Shizhou was a perfect place to set up a radar station to guide the Flying Tigers over the hump. Shizhou is convenient because of its location near the border of China and the rest of southern Asia. So, in order to understand the role of the Zhao ancestral home, one must consider what happened before the Flying Tigers came, when the Flying Tigers were there, and after the Flying Tigers left. The building before the Flying Tigers came was a house that belonged to Mr. Zhao and his family. The house is also known as the Zhao ancestral home. I learned from Mr. Zhao that the building was built around 200 years ago. His family immigrated from Tianjin about 500 years ago and then settled here in Shizhou. The house was not as lively and interesting as it was just a house before the Flying Tigers came. The house was used just for living until the 1930s. When the Flying Tigers came to Shizhou, it was the late 1930s, and this was before the Americans were officially in the war. The Americans were trying to help the KMT and Chiang Kai-shek fight off the Japanese. During this time, everyone knew about the war of Japan and China. However, some did not know the purpose of the Flying Tigers. Mr. Zhao described that most people just knew the Flying Tigers were here, not the purpose or reason why. The radar station is Mr. Zhao's ancestral home that has a satellite, and it provided housing for the Flying Tigers. The Flying Tigers were here in Shizhou for the duration of the war, which was about 4 to 5 years. During this time, Mr. Zhao, the owner of the house, had to move out and live somewhere else for a while. Mr. Zhao is part of the family that owns the house. As I said before, it was the Zhao ancestral home. During that time, Mr. Zhao was around 15 years old when the Flying Tigers came. Now, Mr. Zhao is around 67 years old. It was really interesting experience to meet Mr. Zhao because no previous alumni has seen him or the old radar station before. The first day I went out for inquiry project, I knocked on the gate to the old radar station. With help from Jake, I was able to get some information about the Flying Tigers and was invited to come back again to visit to learn more. For the next few weeks, I went to Mr. Zhao's house to learn more information about his life growing up in Shizhou and the effect of the Flying Tigers on his life. I also learned the personal account of the Flying Tigers that I was looking for when I first set out to go to Shizhou. The use of his house was so that planes flying from the Kunming base could get over the hump. The planes would then circle above his house to gain altitude to fly over the hump without any trouble. This house also provided instructions for these planes to circle, how high they needed to go, and what they needed to do to get over the hump. This house would also provide instructions for any planes that would fly from the hump back into Shizhou into Kunming to help keep the Flying Tigers around. During this time, the Flying Tigers received their name due to one famous battle where the Flying Tigers shot down about 200 Japanese planes and received the name Fei Hu. In Chinese, this means Flying Tiger. When I talked to Mr. Zhao about the impact of the Flying Tigers on the Shizhou community, he remembers how kind and positive of an impact they had on the community. For example, the Flying Tigers used the jeeps they had to give rides to people around the village to get places more quickly. Mr. Zhao was on the receiving side of this positive impact while the flying tigers were here. Candy was given out to kids in the area as these kids, including Mr. Zhao, remember them as guys who had white skin, blonde hair, and big noses. Mr. Zhao also remembers how he was mad that he would not be able to live in his house for 4 years, and now looking back, he remembers and knows how important it was for the flying tigers to stay in his home. The Zhao ancestral home has been sitting there for 71 years since the war has ended. The building itself has not changed that much, but the family has. Mr. Zhao's parents have passed away, but now Mr. Zhao lives in this house with his older brother and son. The house has not changed much, but there have been some minor changes that have made the house look different. For example, on the second floor where the flying tigers used to be, there are 2 walls dividing the house into 3 sections. One for Mr. Zhao, one for his son, and one for his older brother. The Zhao ancestral home has been sitting there for 71 years since the war has ended. The building itself has not changed much from the time it has been used for a home and a radar station. However, the family has. Mr. Zhao's parents have passed away. Mr. Zhao also lives in the house now with his older brother and his son. The future of the house is cloudy and somewhat confusing. Mr. Zhao and his family have been living there ever since the flying tigers left. However, the Chinese government wants to change his courtyard and house into a museum about the flying tigers. During one of my Phase 3 work times and a conversation with Mr. Zhao, I asked him what he would say if the government asked to turn his courtyard into a museum. He replied that he would let the government change his house into a museum, and that would mean that he would also have to move out again. Now that we have examined the time before the flying tigers came, when the flying tigers were here, and after the flying tigers left, we know that the Zhao ancestral home played a major role in the flying tigers' history. As my time in Shizhou wraps up, I'll really miss Mr. Zhao and the conversations that I have had with him.